Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Snow. No, we're not talking about snow. No, stop it, everybody, right now. Jeez, what do you think this is? Hello, welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 179. Today we're talking about developing for voice. We're your host this week, Justin Ribeiro, Danny Blue, Leon Revel. Danny, Leon, hola.
Hello, Justin.
That is what I call a cold open.
I was channeling my White Christmas when they're on the train, you know. Snow, 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 snow. It won't be long until we'll all be there with snow. I'm surprised no one stopped me in the middle of that. That is impressive on all accounts.
Nope. I say this is the podcast now.
That should not be the podcast. It could be, I suppose, but no, indeed, we're not doing that thing. Good to see everybody. Before we introduce our guest this week, though, and talk about actual web things as opposed to Justin randomly quoting movies of a bygone era, I'm going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So an intent to ship has been published for Blink, the browser engine used in Chrome, and this is for shadow parts. So this is really, really exciting, and this spec will address some of the issues around styling web components that use the shadow DOM. So I've been looking forward to this. I'm really good to see that in there. So we've confirmed that Microsoft Edge is making a move to Chromium for Edge, which is interesting. So let us know what you think about that on Twitter. NGXS, the state management library for Angular, a project that Danny has been involved with, has got a record number of downloads last week, so that's 42,000 downloads, so congratulations, and really good to see that project's doing really well. And amazing to see that the conference year of 2019 is already kicking off with some call for proposals for React Next in 2019, first of all, and then also Nordic.js. Both of those conferences have got call for proposals out at the moment, so go and check the links out to find out more. And finally, Justin did a thing, so he's built a PWA speedometer for his car, since the one in his car is actually broken. It uses the ambient light sensor API to automatically change to dark mode when it's nighttime, which is really cool. So check out the source code on GitHub to see how he's done that. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Great, Leon. Thank you so much for that. I'm still surprised there's actual things happening in December right now. I thought it was supposed to be a chill month. I know Danny and I were chit-chatting about this earlier. Has not been as chill as I thought, which is awesome because the web keeps getting better. And speaking of better things and whatnot, today we're talking about developing for voice. Voice is all the rage these days. How do you use that? How do you make that better? And we've got a great guest this week to help us explain that. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Literally looking forward to chatting about voice with you today.
So, Dustin, for those out there who don't know you, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am working on voice search at a company called Algolia. You may or may not have heard of us before. If you haven't heard of us, you've certainly used us. We power thousands of different websites and apps for their search. We're a search API. So essentially, if you've ever searched on Twitch, for example, you've actually used Algolia. We also have a service that we provide for open source projects for free called Doc Search. So if you've ever searched on React or Babel, or I think we're over 1,000 different projects now, we actually power their documentation search as well. So I work on voice search on that side. A lot of more people are asking conversational search, and we want to support them. Additionally, I blog about this stuff for developers at my blog, Talking to Computers, and I am the author of a book called Voice Applications for Alexa and Google Assistant on Manning Publications as well.
So you're saying that you know a couple things about voice stuff.
I know a thing or two.
This is good because we have no lack of questions and things. So when we talk about voice, there seems to be a lot of, I'm not going to say confusion, but when we talk about actually what is voice? Like, what does voice mean to most developers you talk to? Because it means a lot of different things, kind of depending on which platform you seem to be on.
Yeah, there's sort of the way to think about it, or the way I think about it at least, is voice can be an input or voice can be an output. And what we usually refer to, and we refer to about voice on the web at least, is voice as an input. So voice really to drive that interaction. And this can be a very simple interaction, as simple as searching, right? So we just provide our input through voice, and then we might switch to tapping and swiping. Or this can be as complex as this being the entire interaction back and forth, whether it's a conversation, a game, or really anything. So voice is simply just a different way, and in some ways a better way. Some ways, honestly, it's not as good of a way to interact with the device.
But Dustin, voice doesn't have a DOM in it. So when we're talking about voice for the web, what really does that mean? How does that impact? Because it's not just gluing a Google Home Mini onto the side of your computer, I'm assuming.
Right. No, it's not.
Isn't it though? Isn't it?
I mean, you can certainly try that. You can certainly see how that works. But no, you're right. I think this is at least one of the trends that I see in the web, and I'm listening to this podcast as well. You've seen it as also that the web is increasingly taking on these capabilities that have so far been the domain of native. This is going to be a more fully featured thing, and voice is one of these. And voice is really great because it's actually been around for a while, right? We have things like the IVR, which is sort of the say checking if you want to open your checking account, say savings if you want to speak about your savings account. But also on the web as well, with things like screen readers, or for navigating through computers sort of accessibility wise, it's been there as well. So now what we're looking at is having this directly in the web as well, so that developers can take advantage of it, not just for the people who need it for accessibility, but for those of us who may need it in more of a situational type of context, where voice can really step in and be the easier way to interact with these applications. Because we're all going to be in situations where the keyboard's not the way to go. I saw a recent study from PricewaterhouseCoopers that said already 71% of people would rather search through voice than keyboard. And so whether it's they're on the go, they're in their car, they're holding a baby, they have a Galaxy Note and they can't reach all the keys on the keyboard, voice can step in there sometimes and really be the way that people want to interact with these websites and apps.
Yeah, and the web has had, specs sort of around the notion of speech for quite some time, actually. I think speech recognition, which was part of the web speech API, was in Chrome since, I want to say, M30s, somewhere around there. And then you've got sort of things like you said, it's like speech synthesis, which has been much more widely supported in things like Safari and even Firefox and Edge. So, it's the web is an interesting place. Like, we have a lot of API sort of surface, but not necessarily a lot of visibility to all those APIs, especially when it comes to things like speech, where library seems to have filled that gap for the things that we really want speech to do for us.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I was looking at it recently, and one of the earliest specs that I was able to find data back to, I believe, 2005 or 2006. And so not much progress was made on there. And so it was taken up again recently. And just like you mentioned, it is in there natively in Chrome for anyone to use behind a vendor prefix, but it is available for anyone to use. It's not as commonly known, but it is behind a flag on Firefox. And looking at the issue tracker, their original goal was to have that rolled out in Q2 of 2018. It's not finished yet, but perhaps just around the corner there. Edge is saying that they're investigating it, though who knows with the recent announcements from Microsoft. And then, unfortunately, no real support on the speech recognition side from Safari, though you do have on the speech synthesis side, like you said, support across the board outside of Internet Explorer.
IE.
Oh, good old friend. So I've got quite a simple question really, which is when we start talking about voice on the web, could you give a couple of examples? You've already mentioned search, for example, which is quite an obvious one. But are there any other kind of like good use cases or examples of how applications kind of add that additional like interaction point that is voice? Just to kind of allow people to see some of the kind of cool use cases or useful use cases on the web.
Yeah, I think there's a few. Search is clearly a big one. Another one is sort of intent detection, intent driving. So if search is music from the 90s that is upbeat, then the intent would be play that song from the 90s that's upbeat about dancing and staying out all night. That's sort of the intent. We want something, and this is what we want to do with it. So I think you're going to see increasingly more of that, especially say like in a media context. This makes a lot of sense. Fast forward 10 seconds, rewind 10 seconds, next episode, using that through voice. But you also see it a lot in games as well. So for example, some of the games that I saw recently was Get Me Out of Here. The problem with some of those games is you have to be very careful with your voice UX, so to speak, because speech recognition is not perfect. We know this. It's about 95% accurate in most cases nowadays, which is actually better than humans. Though humans for sure have the context clues that they can lean on a lot more than computers. And it's not going to be as accurate as mashing the A or B buttons are going to be around in a game. There's another really interesting sort of storytelling aspect of it as well. The Netflix series, I believe it's called 13 Reasons Why, they released this sort of interactive story called Talk to the Reasons. And when you're on a mobile device, what it does is essentially it mimics a mobile device. 13 Reasons Why, I've never seen it, but I believe it's all geared around teenagers. And so this is geared around video chat and Instagram and things that I sort of just assume that teenagers do nowadays. And you're using voice to move that story forward. And then finally, there's just some really cool experiments out there. Google, with their Made with Google mini experiments with Google mini sites, has one that I absolutely love that everyone should really check out. It's called MixLab. And voice isn't necessary on this. It could have been done without voice. But what you're doing here is you're making music with your voice, which sounds a little weird. But what you're saying essentially is start with a banjo, add hand claps, add a vocal backing, slow it down, speed it up. And it really does feel like you're the conductor. You're driving this experience, and it's something that I come back to all the time, and it always really provides this smile on my face. So really, the situations, the experiences where voice is useful are those where it's going to be more efficient than typing or tapping, or it's going to provide this sort of joyful moment that immerses people in the experience for something like a game or a story.
I feel like my kids would, you talk about the nature of sort of interacting with things, and we've kind of talked about this on the show before, but kids today do have that different notion of what that interaction sort of looks like, don't they? They don't seem to have, typing seems sort of contrite to them. They're like, well, do I have to pick something up? Do I have to, use something? And sure, they type. But that interaction definitely has sort of expanded from even a few years ago, where voice seemed a little bit finicky. Has voice gotten stronger? I mean, you talked about the accuracy of it, but beyond accuracy, there is this sort of delineating notion in people's brains that it's just not good enough, right? Is it good enough today? Do you see that? Oh, you know what? Voice designed systems now are what's the word I'm looking for? Intuitive enough to sort of operate without sort of looking at the manual.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I want to first talk about something that you mentioned very early, which is you talked about your kids. And the interesting thing about voice is the adoption is very U-shaped. So you have the youth who are picking it up, but it's also very good for the older generation as well, the elderly. You know, I've seen a few times recently when I've been traveling that someone next to me has their phone and they've got the type very big, right? Because it's a little hard to read when it's smaller, or it might be more difficult if you have arthritis or something, or some other accessibility needs where voice can step in and really be that. And to your question of, is it good enough to really drive these interactions? In some ways it is. In other ways, it's still incumbent on the developer to take on a lot of that work. The way I sort of think about it is when you build a website, you are providing a very clear path, right? You're providing these two ropes on the side of a user, and you're saying, you can go here, maybe you can turn off to the left, maybe you can turn off to the right, but I'm telling you exactly where you can go. And you can click this button, you can click that button, you can put this certain type of text in here, but it has to be in email format. If it's not, it's going to tell you that it's wrong, or it's only numbers, things like that. With voice, it's a lot more intuitive for the user because we all know how to speak. And in fact, that drive to speak is so strong that I was reading a book recently that said people can tell when something is speech, even if it's not real words. Sort of that speaking sound, even if it's gibberish, even if it makes no sense, people go, oh yeah, that's speech. I don't understand what it is. It's some other language, or it's whatever, but I can understand it. However, it's then incumbent on the developers to understand what the users might say. So getting back to the example of the gaming, the Get Me Out of Here one was a clever game, but it was also a little frustrating because some of those times I would say up and it would go down. It's sort of a maze that you have to direct someone out of. And I would say up and then it would go down instead. And so the developer needs to be proactive about that and say, okay, what are people going to say? Where might these misunderstandings be? And how can I design that experience where I can avoid those misunderstandings without being so prescriptive? You don't want to ever get to that situation where you're back to say 1 to go up, say 2 to go down, things like that. But you might say, for example, my perfect example is if you're controlling smart lights, you might train the user to say turn out the lights instead of saying turn off the lights, because that sounds too similar to turn on the lights.
That stuff sounds very difficult. Like I really like the analogy you use in terms of thinking about it, like when you're building a website and you're kind of guiding the user to make sure that they, use the product that you've built in the way that it was intended to kind of provide that guidance. But it's certainly because of how natural speech comes and how easy it is to diverge or even see those like guiding lines. It sounds like quite difficult to, solve some of those problems that you mentioned there. So that's quite interesting. Do you find that like a big challenge when you're building like voice-based applications? Is that where the majority of the time is spent to make a good voice application, would you say?
Oh, for sure. Big part of it is twofold, both the input and the output, right? The input has to be how people are going to speak. And there are myriad ways for people to speak, right? If we just think about, let's say, up, for example, right? It could be up, it could be straight, it could be towards there, it could be away from there, depending on how the player is oriented. All of these things you need to keep in mind and you need to understand. You don't need to go overboard, right? You don't need to build in every possible thing that someone might say, but it does require you, perhaps even more than other development, to get in front of users and really have them work with this. One of the things that people recommend a lot is before you build anything, you pretend to be the smart assistant if you have that conversational back and forth, and you pretend to give those responses. The people at NPR do this, and they do it quite intelligently. They put people in a room, they put people I think they give them a puzzle and other things to fidget with, because with voice, often you're not staring right at a screen, and they will essentially speak through a Bluetooth speaker. So that's the input side. You have to understand how people are going to speak to the application and all of the different words and phrasing that they're going to use. And then the output side of it, if you do have that spoken conversation back and forth, it has to sound natural. And too often what we do is we write things out, we type things out. And that's a surefire way to make it sound wooden, to make it sound stilted. And instead, what you need is you need something spoken. And so you need to really start and think about, how are people going to speak? What are the sort of unspoken rules that we have in our conversations that drive our conversations forward and make them more efficient?
Yeah, I just don't know. Like, I mean, I've written voice-based applications in the past. I always find it quite a challenge, even when you've done the research, you've sort of come up with that conversational flow that you think's there. There is always that edge case and that hiccup where, regional dialect, not even from an accent standpoint, just from the notion of the words in that region that means something slightly different. This seems very such a very large challenge. I mean, what's sort of out there today to help sort of alleviate some of that challenge?
Yeah.
For those who don't have entire research teams who just want to slap something together that ideally will kind of work, but ideally not require a user to find the device, throw it across the room.
Yeah. To design the conversation, it is a lot of work. It is. I don't want to downplay that, but you don't need a research team. I don't think you need a design team. Really, what you ultimately need to do is you need to account for what you can come up with, for sure, but you also need to handle the misunderstandings well. And so what that means is getting them back on track and paying attention to if they're making mistakes. So if we're talking about a conversational back and forth, what we need there is, if someone makes a mistake once, or not makes a mistake, if they ask for something that we can't understand once, then what we can say is something like, "Oh, sorry, I don't understand. Can you please repeat that?" If it happens a second time, give them a little bit more guidance. "Oh, sorry, I still don't understand. You can do this or this. What can you do?" If it happens a third time, be very explicit. "Sorry, my fault. Still don't understand you. How about you say it like this?" And that will really guide them as well. But also the thing to know as well with voice on the web specifically is, right now, again, it's just a different type of input. So what we're seeing, at least on the search side, is people are really using it for this one-off type of thing. And the speech to text there is quite good. And so if you have some words in there that don't make a ton of sense, people pick up on that pretty quickly because they have that screen in front of them. They're using it in what I call a voice added context, where voice is very just additive, but they can always fall back to the screen there. And they can go, "Oh, I see on the screen," and you see this with Google or with Siri or anything on a phone where it's giving you that transcript. And they go, "Oh, actually, sorry, I don't understand right there." And they'll look at that and they go, "Okay, that's not what I want." But getting back to the conversation about tooling and how to make this easier, the speech recognition API, at least the native one that's shipping with Chrome right now, is quite quick to implement. There are some libraries out there that make it even easier to implement. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, which is a little ironic in what we're talking about. But it's called Anyang, is a speech recognition library. They call it a speech recognition that just works. And that's something that really handles the recognition, but also handles the permissions and handles all of that. And that's something where if someone just wants to get started right away, only wants to support the browsers that are shipping with it natively, they can go ahead and do that.
How does that speech recognition kind of compare to something like Google Home in terms of accuracy and those kind of things?
It works very, very well. So I'm not entirely 100% sure, but my assumption is that Google is using the same speech recognition inside Chrome that they're using inside for Google Assistant, Google Home. It just makes sense to me. And you can also see as well, Firefox is working on this as well. So they have what they call deep speech, which is open source, and you can use it wherever you want. That's what they're building into the browser right now. And they also have something, this project called Common Voice at voice.mozilla.org. And the idea there is that people with all kinds of different accents or English levels even will go in and they'll speak a sentence, and other people will go in and they will say whether the transcription is right. So you go in there and you can go, okay, well, this person said this, but the transcription didn't understand. And the sort of heartwarming thing to me is that you hear a lot of people for whom it doesn't seem like English is their first language, and the speech to text is understanding it very well. And for me, as someone who's in a country where I don't speak the language fluently, that's fantastic. And looking at the results right there, I just went through it this afternoon, and I found 1 out of, I think, about 50 that wasn't transcribed correctly. And even then, there was just 1 word off.
It seems to me that it's definitely improved over the last few years, but for me, there's still that fear. So we talked about how younger children kind of pick this up much more naturally, and it's kind of they seem to be more inclined to use like a voice interface as opposed to typing or etc. like Justin says. But for me, like when I'm at home by myself, I'll use voice on all of my devices and everything without question, because it's simple and easy. But if you're like out in public, there's still that worry that if you ask it and it doesn't quite work, you kind of look like an idiot. So I still think there's certainly further to go until it becomes so good that it's it just works every time, and there's not or at least it appears to work as well as humans can do it. But it certainly seems to have improved quite significantly over the last few years for sure.
Yeah, I agree with you. No one wants to be that jerk on an airplane saying, play the next song, which is one of the nice things about the web is generally you're going to have that screen to fall back on, but you're exactly right. It has to work, and it has to work the first time in 99% of cases for people to really trust it.
And screens aren't going to go away entirely, because there's always those situations where even if it works perfectly, you're not going to, privacy concerns. There's certain things that you're going to want to ask that, banking related information and stuff like that. Like there's always going to need to be a fallback to use these kind of interfaces. Would you agree?
Yeah. And sometimes not even just privacy. Sometimes voice is just not the input, right? If we want to go extreme, I'm in the midst, fortunately and unfortunately, of a Breath of Wild bender right now, and I don't want to play that saying move forward, hit the enemy, right? That's not going to be the best input for voice. But if we want to be even more day to day, I also don't want to speak out my credit card, not because of privacy so much, even at home, but because it's just easier and it's faster to do it on a keyboard. And there are going to be things where it's really difficult to back out of it, or it's really difficult to put that input in. And if you make a mistake, it's going to cause some issues. And so voice is not there today. And this is one of the problems that a lot of people see with voice commerce on Alexa and Google Assistant at the moment, where that kind of, I'm going to put in my credit card, I'm going to know exactly what I'm doing or what I'm buying is not there yet. And that's why I think this is something where you see the Echo Show, you see these devices, the Google Home Hub. I picked up a Google Home Hub on Black Friday, and it's a fantastic device because that screen does actually add some things in where voice not all the time is perfect. Again, it's where does it make the most sense?
Well, and the making the most sense piece, it seems to me that speech offers itself sort of as an ancillary addition, if only for certain cases where things like accessibility might be improved by speech as opposed to just the generic sort of interfacing we have. Would that be a safe assumption?
Yes and no. Yes and no. The screens will always be around, like we just talked about. Screens will always be around. They will always have their use cases. But I really do see voice taking over more and more from the screens. I think that's because in a lot of ways, voice is a more efficient delivery mechanism. It's faster than typing in a lot of ways. It's faster than tapping in a lot of ways. And it's just sometimes just a lot more pleasant. If we go back to search a little bit, we trained ourselves over the past 30 years to search by keyword, when really the natural thing is to search by sentence or by phrase. And so I see voice taking over more of that. And another thing that I think really plays into it as well is this idea that people are getting tired of being tethered to their screens a lot. And voice in a lot of ways actually allows you to step away, at least right now, before notifications really takes off on these platforms. Voice responds to you when you need it. There's no real draw of saying, oh, I've got a new life in Flappy Bird or whatever. I have to go to it right now. So I think that's going to play into it too. So voice is going to take over more, in my opinion. Screens are always going to be there, and we're going to have a mixture of both.
So I'm actually curious. This segues very nicely into something I did want to talk about, and you mentioned, and that is devices that are built for voice but do have a screen. So you just mentioned the Google Home Hub, which I should agree. I also have one. I have it sitting in my kitchen, and it's one of the first things that I've ever actually used the way that they show people using it, like in commercials, where it literally is just like my hands covered in something, and I'm like, I forgot what this one thing is, and so I'll just lean over and ask it. But I'm curious about that mix, because it is a mix of, and this can tie back to how you would design a lot of this stuff for the web as well. But you have a screen that accepts voice as the primary input, or the intended primary input, that has an output that is both voice and visual. And after you're kind of into that interaction, oftentimes you can use, in the case of the Home Hub, you can use touch to navigate further around within. So when you're designing a voice application or an application that has voice, let's just keep it with the Home Hub to just have it narrowed in, that or the Alexa one. How do you go about designing that type of an application or parts of an application? Because it seems really hard. Like, if you thought responsive web was hard, it's like you can design your application. Well, somebody might be able to see it, but they probably won't be looking at it.
Yeah, the way I think of it is roughly a Venn diagram, where you've got the information that's on the screen and you've got the information that's spoken out. And the information that is on the screen pretty much subsumes, it's pretty much a superset of what's going to be spoken out. You might say something that's not on the screen because you want to drive that conversation. For example, now what do you want, where you're not going to have that on the screen. However, you should really think of the screen as a way to provide more information, because exactly like you said, it's not always that they're going to be looking at the screen. They might have their back to it, whatever. And Google makes it easy. Google makes it easy in terms of you only have 7 or 8 different options that you can provide in terms of that display right there. So there's not much extra that you're going to do. It's just really, hey, if you want to go in depth, if you really need to see it, here it is. Lyrics are a perfect example of this, right? Or if you ask about, hey, what's the age? How old is Justin Bieber today? Then you might want to have a picture of Justin Bieber. You might want to have his birth date. You might want to have a quick bio on there as well. Things where if they don't see it, that's fine. But if they see it, they might go, oh, yeah, that's a nice addition right there. And then on the Alexa side of it, they just came out with something called the Alexa presentation language, which is I haven't dug a ton into it, but essentially going back to the old XML in terms of you're able to provide anything you want. So Google is really providing the bumpers there, and it's providing, hey, these are the only ways you can do it. Whereas Alexa, like you said, with responsive and all of that, they make it easy because there's only 4 sizes, I think, the Echo Spot all the way up to the big screen TV. But you do need to now account for, oh, wow, this is going to be in a lot of different places, and how am I going to provide this?
The multi experience, I admit I quite enjoy. The Home Hub, yeah, I feel like it's an advertisement at this point. But if you haven't, if you find one in a store, you should definitely try it. Like, it is quite the voice/display experience of what happens when you really think about how to make something significantly easier for a wide subset of people. It is probably the most voice used device in my household at this point. And again, mine lives in the kitchen as well, Danny. Like the recipe thing on that thing is amazing. Like, you just talk to it and it flips through, and then you kind of glance at it and it feels very fluid. Like, there's no that janky experience we talked about at the beginning of the show seems very much reduced for that use case. I admit I really want to write an app for that. I have no idea what it's going to be, but by God, it seems much more accessible to me as a developer than some other voice related platforms I've worked on in the past. So when we talk about platforms, there's a lot of platforms out there. What are you using today? Like, what are the things that are making your voice world sort of tick, Dustin?
Yeah, they're certainly building for both Alexa and for Google Assistant. There's some tooling in there if someone really wants to build for both all at once. Jovo is a great library to do that. Jovo allows you to sort of target both at once. And then on mobile as well. Most of the work that I'm doing today is bringing voice to mobile. A lot of times it's just, hey, we're just going to target Chrome, and when Firefox comes out, Safari comes out, whatever, then they'll pick it up as well. But we do have customers who go, no, really, we need to be all across everywhere. So they're going to pull in some speech recognition. Google Cloud's platform, speech to text, is great. Some people use Azure Cognitive Services. Twilio, I haven't worked with, but I'm really excited about what they've been rolling out. And then a special mention to a really cool speech to text and intent detection platform called Snips. Snips is an interesting one. If you haven't heard about it, it lives on the device. So you can put it on a Raspberry Pi, you can put it in a mall kiosk, you can put it in anything where it's going to essentially live on that device. So it's sort of very privacy oriented, which sort of contrasts very well with Alexa and Google just inhaling all of that data. But also it allows the developer to say, okay, well, this person is asking for Madonna, so let's go ahead and bias the speech recognition to what this person is really looking for. So I'm really excited to see what they do too.
In terms of questions that people ask you, I mean, we've talked a lot about, sort of what's out there, how you sort of operate with it. Sort of what things are we missing? Like, because I always feel like, particularly with new paradigms for interaction, there's always that sort of gap that as a novice I wouldn't necessarily know. So yeah. What are those things that you're like, oh, as a developer or someone who's diving into this is the thing that you probably should know, but you won't figure out till later, and then you'll kick yourself because you're better off.
Right. Oh man, I love that question because I've been so enmeshed in it a while, and trying to think back to sort of the beginner mind is always interesting. And I would say it's what we touched on earlier. It's that the developer is responsible for sort of helping guide the user along. And it's a much softer hand than you're going to use than if you're doing it for the web. I would say the other thing that takes a developer from a very beginner voice developer to something that's more advanced is leveraging what you know about the user. And so this doesn't have to be the creepy, I know all of the Facebook pages you like, but it could be as simple as, oh, well, I know you asked this the last time. And so I'm going to use this time, even if it's within the same session. So for example, I love baseball. And so I've built a lot of baseball oriented voice applications. And so if I say, hey, did the Astros win last night? And then I get the score back. And then I say, hey, did the Astros win last night? A second time, I get the score back again. I should be able to, because this is how we have conversations, right? I should be able to say, hey, how'd they do last night? If this person is someone that I've interacted with or a friend, they'll know that I'm talking about the Astros. Or if I say, how did the Astros do last night? And then I go, how about the Rangers? It should be clear that I'm speaking about how did the Rangers do last night. So pulling in some of that context, people, when they're first starting out, they go, this is going to be really complex. And you can make it quite simple if your use case is quite specific. Mine's just baseball, so I know that people are going to ask about last night's game or next game, and they're going to ask about teams. And so if I'm missing any information there, I can go, okay, well, I can just assume that you're referring to the same thing again. And worst case scenario, I just go, oh, well, you asked for the next game, but what team do you want? And just ask for that clarification.
And that all just, and I agree. And I think that's the thing that's still, we're getting much better at it. But again, you think about, a couple years ago when you calling into customer service stuff, and it's, and most of the time now it's say one to go to this or this. It's two parts. It is the speech recognition part. It is being able to parse the sounds that you made into something that can be processed. And then it is the conversational part is the one that I think we've been promised forever.
Yeah.
I actually remember, and I'm just thinking about this now. So one Christmas when I was a kid, I got this enormous robot, using my hands on a podcast but it's this huge robot that came with a headset. I think it was called Commando Bot, but you were supposed to be able to talk into this little thing and have it move around. Now in the commercials, of course, the way these kids are they're just talking to the robot and then it's doing stuff. And that's not the way it works. Of course, it was very much cover it up with your hands and scream forward. And then it would move forward a little bit. And a lot of stuff now is much, much better than that. But I still feel like we're still not 100% to that conversational bit that you just mentioned. And I think that will be really exciting.
Well, is that a processing power problem though? Like have all the bits that require speech recognition to work sort of caught up to the point where we are productive with it now? Because it's like the robot, right? Like the robot you're sitting there screaming at, and it's like, I heard a loud sound, I'm just going to move forward. Like it wasn't so much speech recognition as, I got something of a waveform. I'm going to move. Have all these things sort of lined up? Have we gotten to the sort of over the technological hump?
I think we're if we're not there, we're getting very close. And so this conversation, I honestly think if you have a specific use case for this interaction, whether it's choosing a t-shirt to buy or it's asking about baseball scores, you should be able to have that conversation. It is, I will readily admit, an open-ended conversation where you're going to speak to Alexa or you're going to speak to Assistant and they have no idea what you're going to ask about. We're not there yet. But 99.9% of developers are not building those experiences. And so I think the speech recognition is at a point where you don't have much of an excuse to not be able to build something that's going to get people where they want to go.
I do think it's funny that, we talk about voice and talking to the assistants of the world and whatnot. And yet we won't make phone calls anymore. Like phone calls died. Like everyone's like, no, just text me. But, I have to scream at Siri or whoever I'm screaming at locally to make that all work. there is a touch of irony. Maybe it's poetic justice. It's hard to tell at this point.
Or even when you speak to your assistant to text somebody.
I know, it just cracks me up. I'm like, I want to talk to this person, but I don't want to talk to this person.
Well, you want, if they ask you a question you don't want to respond to, you want to be able to just go, oh, sorry, I didn't see that text.
I feel like that's everyone ghosting me all the time. Like, oh, I didn't see it. I just wasn't there. I saw the check mark next to the thing. No, I never got it. It was never there. I'm sorry.
Anyone with a significant other is just nodding like, yeah, no, Dad.
So I've got a question. It's a pretty simple question, really. So you mentioned that you do stuff both with the Google Assistant and with Alexa. So in terms of somebody, not necessarily talking about particularly that website of things, but if somebody wants to have a go at building like a simple voice-based application to kind of see how these things work and see some of the kind of tools and methodologies you use to build these different things, which one would you kind of recommend that somebody looks at first in terms of simplicity and those kind of things?
I would say probably if you have a device, go with the one that you have the device for. And that would be my first answer. If you have neither, or you're thinking, or if you have both even, I would maybe lean towards the Alexa side. Some of the things that they've done recently are pretty nice. For example, they've got the code right there in the console. Some of the CLI tools are pretty nice. But on the same time, the assistant side is pretty nice as well. Dialog Flow has some interesting feature sets that isn't available on the Alexa side. Additionally, if you build a Dialog Flow agent, is what they call it, sort of the NLU sort of overall picture, then you can easily pull that over to Slack or to, I believe, to WeChat or any of these other sort of conversational services. So it's sort of a Weasley answer, but I think you can't really go wrong with either one. If you want the largest audience, go with Alexa today, but you really would not go wrong with building for a system either.
Leon and I know all about Dialog Flows.
Yay!
We have a yet unreleased web platform podcast action waiting in the wings that we need to publish, but we fought with that for a couple days. Like, why doesn't this work?
I was there. I witnessed this feat. It's and again, I suppose it sort of goes to the conversation. In theory, this is all pretty pieced together in terms of the conversations you want to have with it, and then you kind of run into those normal sort of development road bumps. But the debugging wasn't too bad after Danny threw his computer into a pool, but that was fine. That's just normal debugging procedure.
I want to be clear. It was our fault.
Speak for yourself, Danny.
So we're just up against time. Is there anything we just haven't touched on that we probably should have asked, but just totally did not ask?
No, I think we've covered a lot. And really, I think the best way to get started is simply to get started. As I think as soon as you build something and then you try to interact with it yourself, you'll see where your mindset needs to change from a web perspective. And as soon as you can, if you're building out a POC or you're just hacking away, is try to build something that's a little more conversational and see where that goes.
Well, fantastic. Well, Dustin, if people want to find you out there on the web, whereabouts would they look?
For sure, yeah. I like the whole world. I'm on Twitter @DCoats. And then I blog, like I mentioned, on the technical side of building for voice at talkingtocomputers.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. As things evolve with voice, you'll have to come back on and tell us about all the new wonderfulness that's happening out there.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
Danny, Leon, any closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 179?
Read the docs.
Is that from experience?
Just saying.
Just thank you for coming on, Dustin, and talking about this. Obviously, this is kind of an area which is just getting bigger and bigger, so it's really kind of important to kind of start thinking about these different things for your applications. Thank you very much.
And this has been episode number 179 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've talked about developing for voice with Dustin Coates, and we've talked about how that interacts with the web, what to think about as you're designing these sorts of things, and all things wonderfulness with voice. Tune in next week when we talk more things web platform, more things web, more things development. And we hope to see you next week. Have a great rest of your week.